there are places in this world that still hold their breath, places where the water runs dark and deep, where the mist settles low over still rivers in the early morning hours, and where the silence is not empty, but full of something old, full of something watching. New Zealand is such a place, and in the oldest stories told upon its shores, stories passed in low voices beside firelight, stories woven into the fabric of Maori culture for more than 1,000 years. There lives a creature that no map has ever charted, no net has ever held, and no name quite captures. Though the Maori gave it one anyway. They called it the Taniwha. Say it slowly. Taniwha. Even the sound of it seems to belong to deep water, to caves carved by underground rivers, to the slow pull of ocean currents beneath an overcast sky. The Taniwha, in the traditions of the Maori people, the indigenous Polynesian inhabitants of Aotearoa, New Zealand, is one of the most enduring, most layered, and most misunderstood figures in all of the Pacific world's mythology. It is a creature that has been feared and revered in the same breath, a being that has served as both terror and protector, both warning and guide, for generation after generation after generation. But what, exactly, is the Taniwha? That question, it turns out, does not have a single answer, and that is precisely what makes it so extraordinary. In many accounts, the Taniwha appears as a colossal creature of the water, a being of immense size and supernatural power that dwells in the deep pools of rivers, in ocean caves along the coastline, or in the churning darkness beneath waterfalls. It is described, across various tribal traditions, with the body of a great lizard or tuatara, enormous and scaled, with a back ridged like a mountain range and eyes that hold a cold, knowing light. In some tellings it resembles a shark of impossible scale, a thing of muscle and current and ancient hunger. In others it is more serpentine, sinuous and vast, moving through the water the way a shadow moves through a room, without disturbing a single thing, until suddenly it is right there, and you feel it. Some accounts describe it surfacing not in one fixed shape at all, but shifting, a creature capable of taking different forms depending on its age, its power, or its will. A log drifting toward you on a still river, a dark shape just below the surface of a lake, a ripple that moves against the current. It is formidable in a way that exceeds the merely physical. The Taniwha, in Maori understanding, does not simply occupy a place in the landscape. It is the place. A powerful Taniwha might govern the currents of an entire river, could summon storms, could capsize a canoe with the slow roll of its body far below the waterline. To cross into its territory without acknowledgement, without respect, was understood as one of the more serious mistakes a person could make. People died that way, the elders said. Canoes were lost. Entire journeys came to grief on stretches of river that seemed, to an outsider, perfectly calm. The water does not warn you. The Taniwha does not warn you. They are the same thing. But here is where the Taniwha reveals its true complexity. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story, because it is not only dangerous. The very same creature that could swallow a man might also have saved the ancestors of his tribe. Certain Taniwha are described in oral tradition as guardians, kaitiaki, beings bound by ancient covenant to a particular family or people, watching over them across generations, alerting them to danger, guiding their waka, their canoes, safely through treacherous waters. These are not two different kinds of creature. They are the same kind. What differs is the relationship. The Taniwha, then, is not simply a monster. It is something older than the word monster allows for. The stories began, as the Maori themselves began, with the Great Migration from Hawaii, the ancestral homeland somewhere to the northeast, from which the first peoples sailed to Aotearoa across thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean. Those canoe voyages were among the most remarkable feats of navigation in human history, and the stories that grew around them included Taniwha, beings that accompanied certain canoes, that guarded the hulls from beneath, that occasionally dragged a vessel off course to save it from something worse waiting ahead. Over the centuries of settlement, Taniwha became woven into the geography of the islands themselves. Nearly every significant river, every coastline, every deep lake carried stories of one. Sometimes named, sometimes described only by the destruction it had caused or the people it had protected. Kupe, the great navigator who first charted these islands, was said to have encountered Taniwha in his voyages. The rivers of the Waikato, the bays of Northland, the deep sounds of the South Island, all have their Taniwha, all have their dark shape in the water. And then, quietly, across the centuries, the sightings began to accumulate. Not just the old stories, not just the inherited accounts, but described encounters, reported observations, fishermen who returned from certain stretches of river white-faced and short on words, divers who described a shape far below them, too large, too deliberate, too aware to be anything their training had prepared them for, travelers who heard something moving in the dark water beneath their boat on a clear, windless night. In 1998, a proposed road construction project near Ngaruawahia was formally delayed after Maori elders reported that it would disturb the territory of a local Taniwha, and the New Zealand government, to its credit, took the concern seriously enough to pause and reconsider. The Taniwha, in other words, has never been merely historical. It remains present. It continues to be spoken of, not as legend comfortably sealed in the past, but as something still inhabiting these islands, still moving through their deep waters, still watching from somewhere just beyond the edge of what can be seen. This is its story. Or rather, this is the beginning of its story, because a creature this old, this layered, this deeply embedded in the life of a people and the landscape of a land, cannot be told in a single breath. So settle in. The water is deep here, and we have time. To understand the Taniwha, you must first understand the ocean. Not the ocean as a highway, not the ocean as a resource, but the ocean as it was understood by the Polynesian peoples who mastered it over thousands of years. As a living world, vast and possessed of its own logic, its own moods, its own inhabitants both seen and unseen. The Pacific Ocean, at its widest, stretches nearly 20,000 kilometers from shore to shore. It covers more of the Earth's surface than all of the land combined, and yet the ancestors of the Maori people crossed great portions of it in open canoes, navigating by stars, by current, by the behavior of birds and the color of the water, and the feel of the wind on skin that had learned, over generations, to read such things the way others read words on a page. These were not accidental voyages. They were not people blown off course and washed up on unfamiliar shores. They were deliberate, organized, accomplished by communities of extraordinary navigational knowledge and extraordinary courage. And they carried with them, in the hulls of those great double-hulled canoes, their Weka Aurua, not only food and tools and planting stock and the bones of ancestors, but stories, beliefs, a whole cosmological understanding of the world and the creatures that governed its most dangerous places. The Taniwha came with them from Hawaii. They did not discover a land that already had its monsters. They arrived with theirs, and the land confirmed everything. Hawaii, the ancestral homeland of the Maori and related Polynesian peoples, is not a place that appears on any modern map with certainty. Scholars have long debated its precise location, with the most compelling evidence pointing toward the Society Islands of what is now French Polynesia, particularly the island of Raiatea. But in Maori tradition, Hawaii is more than a geographical origin point. It is the place from which the people came, and to which the spirits of the dead return. It is simultaneously historical and sacred. And in its waters, in the vast uncharted deep surrounding it. The concept of the Taniwha was already very much alive. Throughout Polynesia, related traditions of grey water creatures exist. Beings of supernatural power associated with the sea, with particular passages of ocean, with the dangerous zones between islands where currents converge and the water turns strange. The Maori tradition of the Taniwha is the most elaborate and most geographically detailed of these. But it did not arise in isolation. It is part of a broader Pacific understanding that the ocean is not empty, that it has guardians, that there are places within it that belong to beings far older and far larger than anything that walks on land. When the great migration canoes departed Hawaii, in the oral traditions, this is known as the period of the Heke. The fleet, though scholars recognize these were likely multiple journeys across many generations, rather than one single departure. Several of them were said to have been accompanied by Taniwha, not following at a distance, not observed from afar, but traveling with the canoes, beneath them, alongside them. In some accounts, a Taniwha might take hold of a canoe's hull in rough water and stabilize it. In others, a Taniwha would surface ahead of the vessel and lead it away from a reef or away from a stretch of water where a storm was building beyond the visible horizon. These were not random creatures. They were known beings, with names, with histories, with relationships to specific families, specific iwi or tribes. The bond between a Taniwha and a people was considered ancestral, which in Maori understanding is among the most serious and binding of all categories. An ancestral obligation does not expire. It does not become less real with the passing of generations. It deepens. The canoe Tainui, one of the most celebrated of the great migration canoes in Maori oral tradition, is associated with a Taniwha named Uruwao, said to have accompanied it on its passage south. When Tainui reached Aotearoa and was eventually hauled ashore and placed in its final resting place near the Waikato River, the connection between its descendants and the Taniwha of those waters endured for centuries after. Consider for a moment what that migration actually felt like. You are on a canoe, enormous by the standards of the time, but still open to the sky, still surrounded on every side by water that extends without interruption in every direction. The stars above you are your only fixed reference. Below you is an ocean of unknown depth. At night, the water is black and perfectly opaque, and things move in it. You can see their phosphorescent trails sometimes, long green-white streaks of light beneath the surface, shapes too large and too deliberate to be fish. The ocean makes sounds, it breathes, and you are crossing it with everything you own, everyone you love. Every seed that will feed your children in a new place you have never seen but have heard described, in stories told by those who went before you and returned, or by those who did not return but sent word some other way. In that context, the idea of a Taniwha beneath your canoe is not frightening, it is reassuring. It means the deep is not indifferent to you. It means something down there knows your name. When the canoes arrived at Aotearoa, that long, rugged, mountainous archipelago at the southwestern edge of the Polynesian world, they found an island landscape unlike anything in the tropical Pacific. Here were great rivers, cold and fast, rushing down from snow-capped ranges to the sea. Here were deep fjords along the southwest coast, carved by glaciers, plunging to extraordinary depths with walls of dark rock rising sheer from the water. Here were lakes in the volcanic heart of the North Island, warm and steaming at their edges, dropping to depths that no diver had yet found the bottom of. Here were coastal caves that filled and emptied with the tide, and underground rivers that surfaced without warning in the middle of flat plains. Every one of these places was exactly the kind of place a Taniwha would inhabit. The land confirmed everything the stories had already said, and so the Taniwha did not need to be invented anew for this new land. They simply needed to be found here, recognized in the dark pools, in the surging river mouths, in the deep coastal sounds where the water went cold very quickly below the surface, and strange upwellings brought things from the bottom that no one could quite name over the generations of settlement. And the Maori settled Aotearoa for somewhere between 600 and 800 years before European contact. The Taniwha became inseparably mapped onto the geography of these islands. Each tribe, in settling its territory, came to know the Taniwha of its rivers and coasts. These beings were named, their habits observed, their territories respected. Boundaries in the landscape were often Taniwha boundaries. A river crossing that was considered dangerous was not merely hydraulically hazardous. It was the home of a being that had not been properly acknowledged. There is something in this that modern minds sometimes struggle to sit with comfortably. We tend to draw a sharp line between the geographical and the mythological, between the real features of a landscape and the stories told about them. But in the Maori worldview, as in many indigenous worldviews, that line does not exist in the same place or in the same way. The Taniwha of a particular river is not a story about the river. It is an aspect of the river. It is what the river is when fully understood. Its character, its danger, its history, its relationship to the people who live alongside it. To remove the Taniwha from the river is not to demythologize it. It is to misunderstand it entirely. This is why, when European settlers arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries and began to dismiss these accounts as superstition, as the colorful but ultimately harmless fictions of a pre-scientific people, something significant was lost in translation. Not the Taniwha. The Taniwha did not require the belief of newcomers to continue inhabiting its pools. What was lost was the understanding that these stories were carrying real information about which stretches of river were genuinely dangerous and why, information about seasonal flood behaviors, about underwater geography, about the locations of hidden reefs and sudden drop-offs. The Taniwha was, among other things, an extraordinarily efficient way of encoding and transmitting practical knowledge about a landscape across many generations, in a form that no one would forget, because no one forgets a monster. And yet, it was never only that. To reduce the Taniwha to a mnemonic device, a clever metaphor for hydraulic danger, is to make the opposite error from those who dismissed it entirely. The Taniwha is real in its own tradition. It occupies a real category of being. It has a relationship with the sacred, with the ancestral, with the living world that is not reducible to any single Western analytical framework. It came across the ocean with the people. It settled into the rivers and bays and deep lakes of a new land. It watched as villages were built on its banks, as children learned to swim in its shallows, as wars were fought on its bridges, and canoes were launched from its shores. It is still here. It has simply been here longer than almost anything else. And as we move deeper into its story, as we begin to meet, one by one, the named Taniwha of specific rivers and coastlines, and to understand the full spectrum of what this creature has meant to the people who have always known it, the picture will only deepen. We are still near the surface. There is a great deal more below. There is a question that surfaces sooner or later in every serious conversation about the Taniwha. And it is a deceptively simple one. Is it good or is it dangerous? The honest answer, the only honest answer, is that the question itself is the wrong shape. It is a question built for a different kind of creature, a different kind of story, a different way of understanding the relationship between power and morality. In the tradition of many cultures, supernatural beings tend to be sorted: gods of light and gods of darkness, angels and demons, protectors and destroyers. The categories are meant to be stable. You know in advance which side of the line a being inhabits. You know what to expect from it. The Taniwha does not cooperate with this arrangement. In Maori tradition, the Taniwha exists fully on both sides of what we might call the moral ledger, not because it is neutral, not because it is indifferent, but because its behavior is entirely, precisely, and consistently relational. What it does depends entirely on what you are to it, and what you have done, and how you have conducted yourself in its territory. The Taniwha is not good. The Taniwha is not evil. The Taniwha is, in the deepest sense of the word, responsive. This is a more sophisticated moral framework than it might first appear. And to understand it properly, we need to sit with both faces of the creature, the guardian and the devourer, and resist the temptation to decide which one is the real one. Let us begin with the guardian, the Kaitiaki Taniwha, because it is, in many ways, the more tender story. The word Kaitiaki in Te Reo Maori carries meanings that English does not easily accommodate in a single term. It means guardian, yes, but also caretaker, steward, protector. It implies an ongoing, active responsibility, not merely the absence of harm, but the presence of care. A Kaitiaki Taniwha is a being that has, at some point in the deep past, entered into a covenant of protection with a particular group of people. This relationship might have been initiated by an ancestor of extraordinary manner, personal power, and prestige, who encountered a Taniwha and formed a bond with it, earning its loyalty through respect, through ritual, through some act of recognition that the creature found worthy. In some accounts, the relationship is even older. The Taniwha itself is understood as an ancestor, a being that once existed in human form and, upon death, transformed into this powerful creature, guardian of its descendants. That last idea is worth sitting with for a moment. In Maori cosmology, the boundary between the human and the more than human is not a wall. It is a threshold. Beings move across it. A person of sufficient spiritual weight, sufficient tapu, or sacred power, might, in death, become something other than a ghost, something that retains will and memory and the desire to protect, but now inhabits a body built for the ocean, built for the deep river, built to exist permanently in that liminal zone between the seen world and the unseen one. A Taniwha of this kind is not watching over its descendants from some distant spiritual realm. It is here, in the water, 50 meters downstream, waiting, alert, invested. Among the most celebrated Kaitiaki accounts is that of Ara Ituru, a female Taniwha associated with the Hokianga Harbor in Northland. She is said to have guided the great migration canoe Mahuhuki Te Rangi safely to shore upon its arrival in Aotearoa, navigating the harbor entrance for the vessel, ensuring its people landed safely. Her descendants, the iwi of that region, maintained relationship with her across generations, and her presence in those waters was not merely remembered, but continuously acknowledged. The Kaitiaki Taniwha watches. It observes the movements of those under its protection. When danger approaches, whether from the sea, from an enemy, from a coming storm, or from a decision being made in ignorance of what lies ahead, it acts. Sometimes that action is dramatic, a Taniwha surfacing to capsize an enemy canoe that has entered protected waters. More often it is subtle, a disturbance in the water that causes a fishing party to turn back before the weather turns. An inexplicable reluctance in a canoe that, resisted, would have crossed a bar at the wrong moment of the tide. A dream, in a night before a journey, vivid enough that even a pragmatic man decides to wait one more day. The guardian Taniwha operates at the edges of perception. It does not announce itself in most accounts. It simply makes certain things happen and prevents others. Its presence is felt more often than it is seen. And then there is the other face, the the devouring Taniwha, the creature that takes people, that capsizes canoes without mercy, that inhabits certain stretches of water like a sovereign who tolerates no trespass, is not a corrupted version of the Guardian. It is not the Guardian gone wrong. It is a different expression of the same essential nature, encountered under different conditions. Across Maori oral tradition, the accounts of Taniwha violence tend to share a common structure. A person, or a group, enters a body of water that is known to be the territory of a powerful being. The entry is made without proper acknowledgement, without the karakia, the ritual prayers and invocations that signal awareness and respect, without the deference that the place demands, and the Taniwha responds, not with warning, not with a preliminary display of displeasure. It simply acts, and the result is catastrophic. A swimmer pulled under and not seen again, a canoe overturned in still water for no explicable reason, a diver who descends and does not ascend. From a Western perspective, this can read as arbitrary cruelty, but that reading misses something important about the logic at work. The Taniwha is not cruel in these accounts. It is consistent. Its rules are known. The territory is marked, not with signs that the eye can read, but with knowledge that the community holds and passes on. The danger is not hidden, it is taught. A child growing up beside a river with a powerful Taniwha knows, from early childhood, which pools are its domain, what protocols exist for crossing those pools, and what the consequence of ignoring those protocols has historically been. The knowledge is as practical as knowing which plants are poisonous. It is encoded in story precisely because story is the most durable carrier of information a pre-literate community possesses. When someone is taken by a Taniwha, the community's response is rarely one of outrage directed at the creature. There is grief, yes. There is mourning, but the dominant register, in many accounts, is something closer to solemn acknowledgement. The place was what it was. The being that inhabited it was known. The person crossed into its territory, and the expected thing occurred. This is not callousness. It is a worldview in which the rights of powerful non-human beings are genuinely taken seriously, in which the landscape has its own kind of sovereignty that human beings are obligated to recognize. There is a third category worth noting, one that sits between the devoted guardian and the sovereign devourer, and that reveals perhaps the most nuanced dimension of the Taniwha tradition. These are the Taniwha of ambiguous intent, beings that have a relationship with the people, but whose behavior is not always protective, beings that, in some accounts, abduct women, carrying them off to their underwater dwellings, keeping them there, sometimes for generations, beings that might assist one group of travelers while simultaneously being a mortal danger to another group on the same river the same day. These accounts resist easy interpretation, and scholars of Maori tradition have approached them with appropriate care. What they seem to encode at one level is the idea that the Taniwha's perspective is not human. Its attachments, its loyalties, its understanding of what constitutes appropriate behavior are governed by a logic that is not fully accessible to the people who share its landscape. It can be related to. It can be respected, appeased, communicated with through ritual, but it cannot be entirely predicted, and it cannot be fully controlled. There is always a remainder, a dimension of its nature that exceeds the relationship, that belongs to the deep water and not to the human world alongside it. This is, when you sit with it, a remarkably honest account of how power actually works in the natural world. The ocean does not care about you, but it can also be navigated, read, worked with, if you approach it with sufficient knowledge and sufficient humility. The river is indifferent to your schedule, but it is not beyond understanding. The Taniwha, as a concept, holds all of this simultaneously. The possibility of relationship, the necessity of respect, the hard limit of what relationship and respect can guarantee. It is a way of being in the world that asks something of you. It asks you to pay attention, to know where you are and whose territory you are in, to approach power, natural power, ancestral power, the power of places that have existed long before you arrived and will exist long after you leave, with an awareness that the world does not exist for your convenience. The Taniwha teaches this. Whether as guardian or devourer, it teaches this. And in the rivers and harbors and deep coastal sounds of Aotearoa, where specific Taniwha, with specific names and specific histories, have inhabited specific places for as long as human memory reaches, that teaching has never stopped. It is in those named creatures, those particular beings of particular places, that we turn next. A name is not a small thing. In many traditions, to name a powerful being is to begin a relationship with it. It is to say, I know you are here. I know what you are. I acknowledge your presence in this place. And by speaking your name, I enter into the long human practice of reckoning with you honestly, rather than pretending you do not exist. Names in the Maori tradition carry particular weight. They encode lineage, event, spiritual identity, and the relationship between the named and the namer. To know a Taniwha's name is to know something essential about it, where it lives, what it has done, who it belongs to or who belongs to it. Across the length and breadth of Aotearoa, the Taniwha have names. Many of them. The catalogue of named Taniwha in Maori oral tradition is extensive, more extensive than most outsiders realize, and each name is attached to a specific place, a specific body of water, a specific record of encounters. These are not interchangeable. The Taniwha of the Waikato River is not the Taniwha of the Hokianga Harbour. The creature known from the deep lakes of the Rotorua Plateau is a different being entirely from the vast force said to govern the open ocean passages between the North and South Islands. Each has its own character, its own history, its own way of making itself known. What follows is not a complete account. No single documentary could contain all of them, but it is a careful meeting with some of the most significant, some of the most storied, some whose names, even now, cause a particular quality of quiet to settle over those who know them well. We begin in the north, Reituru, Hokianga Harbour, Northland. Among the most beloved of all, named Taniwha, Reituru is a female being, a distinction that carries significance in Maori tradition, where feminine Taniwha are often associated with nurturing, guidance, and the safe delivery of people across dangerous passages. She is understood to have accompanied the great canoe Mahuhuki Te Rongi on its voyage from Hawaii, traveling beneath the hull across thousands of miles of open Pacific, and to have guided that canoe safely through the treacherous bar at the entrance to the Hokianga Harbour upon its arrival in Aotearoa. The Hokianga Bar, where the river meets the sea in a churning, constantly shifting shallows, has taken many vessels over the centuries. Reituru's role was to know its moods from below, to understand the interaction of current and tide and sandbank in a way that no human navigator could, and to use that knowledge in service of the people she had accompanied across half the world. The iwi of the Hokianga region maintained their relationship with Reituru across many generations. She was not spoken of in the past tense. The harbour was understood to remain her domain, and the particular behavior of that harbour entrance, its unpredictability, its occasional deadly caprice, was explained partly in terms of her continued presence and the necessity of approaching her waters with appropriate awareness. Fishermen who knew the tradition would offer acknowledgement before crossing the bar. Those who did not, the elders observed with measured understatement, sometimes found the crossing more difficult than expected. Kataore, Rotorua lakes and surrounding waterways. Central North Island. Kataore is among the most fearsome of the named Taniwha, a being associated primarily with the geothermally active lake country of the central North Island, where the water runs warm in places, where the earth breathes sulfurous steam, and where the lakes drop to depths that have not been fully charted even by modern instruments. Kataore's accounts are predominantly those of the devouring kind. He is described in oral tradition as enormously long, a creature of sinuous, serpentine body, capable of moving through the lake system with terrible speed, and as deeply territorial in a way that allowed no negotiation. The stretches of water he claimed were claimed absolutely. Travelers who failed to observe the correct protocols when crossing his domain were taken without exception, the accounts say, and taken without the body ever being recovered, which in Maori tradition carries its own particular weight of grief, since the recovery and proper treatment of the dead was a matter of deep spiritual importance. What makes Kataore additionally significant is the specificity of the landscape he inhabits. The Rotorua Lake District is genuinely strange country, a volcanic plateau where the ground itself is unstable, where lakes of vivid color sit in old explosion craters, where the border between the geological and the supernatural feels, even to a modern visitor, genuinely thin. That a being of Kataore's nature should inhabit these waters is, in one reading, simply an expression of the place's own character, powerful, unpredictable, indifferent to human comfort, possessed of energies far older than human presence on the islands. Haumea Partiki. The Waikato River. The Waikato River flows for 425 kilometers from its source in the volcanic highlands of the Tongariro Massif to its mouth on the west coast south of Auckland, the longest river in Aotearoa, and one of the most historically significant waterways in all of New Zealand. It is the ancestral river of the Waikato iwi and their confederation, and it carries within its waters a deep population of Taniwha accounts. Haumea Partiki is perhaps the most prominent of these, a being understood to inhabit a particular deep reach of the river where the current slows and the water darkens, and where, across generations, people have been lost in circumstances that no hydraulic explanation fully satisfied. What distinguishes Haumea Partiki in the tradition is the element of warning. Unlike the most purely territorial Taniwha, accounts of this being include instances of a preliminary signal, a disturbance of the water, an unusual current, a sound from below the surface, before the full consequence of transgression was delivered. Whether this constitutes mercy or simply a different operational style, the elders did not venture to say definitively. The Waikato River's Taniwha tradition became notable in the modern era in 2002, when work on a new highway near the river was formally challenged by local Maori, who reported that the proposed route would disturb the dwelling place of a Taniwha named Te Narara Warao. The challenge was taken seriously enough to attract national and international media attention, with responses ranging from respectful engagement to pointed ridicule, depending on the outlet. The New Zealand government ultimately modified the route. We will return to this episode at greater length in our final segment, because it represents something important about where the Taniwha tradition stands in the contemporary world. Te Parata, the open ocean. And then there is Te Parata, a being of an altogether different scale and category from those we have met so far. Te Parata does not inhabit a river or a harbor or a coastal cave. Te Parata inhabits the ocean itself, the open, the deep, the place where the water has no bottom that any rope has ever reached. In Maori cosmological tradition, Te Parata is understood as the being responsible for the tides, the vast rhythmic breathing of the ocean that raises and lowers sea levels around every coast in the world, twice each day, with a regularity that is itself almost supernatural. The mechanism, in this telling, is simple and immense. Te Parata breathes. When it inhales, the waters are drawn toward it, and the tides go out. When it exhales, the waters return and the tides come in. The ocean's most fundamental rhythm is the breath of a single living being of incomprehensible size. In some accounts, Te Parata is also associated with the great maelstroms, the whirlpools that open in deep water far from shore, where currents converge in ways that have no surface explanation, pulling debris and occasionally vessels in slow, irresistible spirals downward. Te Parata occupies a different tier of the Taniwha hierarchy. If hierarchy is even the right word for something so vast that it encompasses rather than inhabits, it is less a creature of particular place than a creature of elemental force. You do not enter Te Parata's territory by crossing a river without proper acknowledgement. You enter it by going to sea at all. Every ocean voyage in Maori tradition was, at some level, a navigation of Te Parata's domain, which is why the prayers and rituals surrounding ocean travel were among the most elaborate and seriously observed in the entire ceremonial life of the community. The ocean was not background. It was the territory of something alive. Beyond these four, the named Taniwha of Aotearoa include Titaiaporoporo of the Wanganui River, whose presence is said to explain that river's most dangerous rapid. Horomatangi, a volcanic Taniwha said to inhabit Lake Taupo at its deepest point and responsible for the region's seismic activity. And Peke Hayata of the South Island's Kaikoura coast, a being of the deep ocean shelf associated with the extraordinary marine life, concentrated in those waters where the continental shelf plunges sharply into the abyss. Each name is a geography. Each geography is a story. Each story is still being told. What strikes a careful listener moving through these accounts one by one is not the violence, though the violence is present and is not minimized. It is the intimacy. These are not distant, abstract forces. They are local, specific, known. The people who lived beside Kataure's lakes knew him the way they knew the personality of the weather in that particular valley, the way they knew which slopes were safe to plant and which were prone to slipping after heavy rain. The Taniwha of a place was knowledge of that place, carried in a form that could not be forgotten. There is also something worth noting about what the named Taniwha collectively reveal about Maori geography. To map the Taniwha of Aotearoa is to map the most significant, most dangerous, most ecologically powerful waterways of the islands. The deep river pools, the treacherous harbor bars, the thermally active lakes, the open ocean passages between islands, the places where the continental shelf drops away into cold darkness. Every one of these is a Taniwha place. Every one of these is also, by any modern measure, a zone of genuine natural power and genuine natural danger. The Taniwha were the landscape, its power made personal, its danger made specific, its character made knowable through story in a way that pure description never quite achieves. And in the centuries since European contact, as the landscape itself changed, as rivers were dammed and drained, as harbors were dredged, as coastlines were developed, and ancient pools were filled and built upon, the question of what happens to a Taniwha when its home is destroyed began, slowly and urgently, to press itself forward. That question, and the answers being worked out in the living world right now, belong to the next chapter of this story. History has a way of being tidier than the truth. We speak of ancient beliefs and modern knowledge as though they occupy separate rooms, as though the door between them closed at some identifiable point in time and has remained shut ever since. But the accounts do not cooperate with that arrangement. The sightings did not stop. The reports did not dry up. The Taniwha did not quietly retire from active duty when the first European ships arrived in Aotearoa's harbors, or when the missionaries began their work, or when the colony became a nation, and the nation began to build roads through places the Maori had always known to approach with care. The accounts simply continued, in different registers, in different languages, from different kinds of witnesses, but they continued. The earliest European accounts of Taniwha encounters tend to be recorded at a careful remove. Missionaries and colonial administrators in the 18th and 19th centuries wrote down what they heard from Maori informants, usually framing the stories as evidence of the superstitious nature of the people they were documenting, occasionally noting with mild puzzlement that the informants did not seem in any way doubtful about what they were describing. These records, whatever the intentions behind them, preserve something valuable, testimony from people who were speaking not about inherited mythology, but about things that had happened to people they knew, in places they could name, within living memory. Among the most frequently cited bodies of early recorded testimony is the work of Sir George Grey, Governor of New Zealand in the mid-19th century, who made a serious effort to collect and preserve Maori oral tradition in writing. His compilations, published in the 1850s, contain numerous Taniwha accounts, some of them described by his informants as recent events rather than ancient stories. There is a quality to these accounts that distinguishes them from pure mythology. They include specific names of witnesses, specific locations described with the precision of people who know a landscape well, and specific consequences, injuries, deaths, disappearances, that were understood at the time to be directly attributable to the being named. Moving into the 20th century, the accounts shift in character, but do not diminish. Reports from the 1930s and 1940s describe fishermen working the deep river pools of the Waikato and Wanganui river systems encountering something in the water that behaved in ways inconsistent with any known fish species, too large, moving against the current with apparent ease, surfacing briefly to reveal a profile that witnesses struggled to fit into any familiar category. These accounts were rarely published. They circulated locally, within communities that had the context to receive them, without requiring the witnesses to defend their sanity, and within those communities they were filed alongside the existing tradition without particular surprise. The being was known to be there. The fisherman had seen it. These two facts were not in tension with each other. 1970s. Hokianga Harbour, Northland. A commercial diver working on a submerged structure near the harbour entrance reported surfacing abruptly after encountering a shape below him that he initially took for a submerged log, until it moved, fluidly and with direction, into deeper water. The diver, by his own account, not a man given to imagination, refused to re-enter the water at that site and submitted a written report to his employer describing the encounter. The report noted, with some understatement, that the shape had been considerably larger than anything he had previously encountered in those waters. That account sits in a category occupied by dozens of similar reports across the latter half of the 20th century. Credible witnesses, specific locations, descriptions that are consistent with each other in their essential strangeness and in their shared quality of incompleteness. The witnesses do not claim to have seen the whole creature clearly. They describe a portion, a back, a movement, a shadow, a depth. And that portion is enough to end a dive, to turn the boat around, to prompt a report that the witness knows will be received with skepticism by some audiences and with quiet recognition by others. And then there is 2002. In that year, Transit New Zealand, the government agency responsible for highway construction, proposed a route for a new expressway near Engaruawahi in the Waikato. The proposed route would have passed through land that local Maori identified as the dwelling place of a Taniwha named Te Ngarara Huaro. The objection was formally raised through the resource consent process, the legal mechanism by which communities can challenge development proposals on cultural or environmental grounds. And the objection was, at its heart, straightforward. The road would disturb the home of a being whose presence in that place was real, documented in tradition, and entitled to consideration. The response from some quarters of the national media was mockery. Headlines asked whether the government was seriously allowing a monster to hold up a highway. Columnists deployed the full range of tools available to those who have decided in advance that a thing is ridiculous. But within the formal process, something different happened. The objection was treated as a legitimate cultural concern under the Resource Management Act, which in New Zealand law requires that the spiritual and cultural relationship of Maori with their ancestral lands and waters be taken into account in planning decisions. The route was reviewed, modifications were made. The expressway was not stopped, but it was adjusted in ways that reflected a genuine attempt to accommodate the concern rather than simply overrule it. This episode became, in retrospect, a kind of landmark, not because it resolved the tension between indigenous tradition and modern infrastructure, but because it made that tension visible in an unusually public way, and because the legal outcome demonstrated that the tension was not merely philosophical. It had practical, material consequences. Roads could be moved. Routes could be reconsidered. The presence of a Taniwha in a place was not, under New Zealand law, simply a matter of private belief. It was a matter of cultural heritage with legal standing. The Taniwha in 2002 went briefly viral, in the early, pre-social media sense of that word, and the conversation it generated has not fully closed since. There is a bend in the Whanganui River where the water slows. The hills come close on both sides, covered in the deep green of native bush, the kinds of trees whose names take time to learn and whose age, once you understand it, produces a particular quality of stillness in the person standing beneath them. The river at this bend is wide and dark and moves with a kind of unhurried authority, as though it has been doing this for long enough that it no longer needs to hurry, which it has. The Whanganui is one of the oldest river systems in Aotearoa. People have lived along its banks for hundreds of years. And in the tradition of those people, this river is not merely a waterway. It is a being. It is, in the words of an extraordinary piece of legislation passed by the New Zealand Parliament in 2017, a legal person. The Whanganui River Claim Settlement Act of that year granted the Whanganui River Te Awa Tupua in Te Reo Maori, the river with the power of an ancestor, the same legal rights as a person. It can be represented. It can be harmed. Harm to it is harm that the law recognizes and can act upon. 2 guardians were appointed to speak on its behalf in legal proceedings, one from the Crown, one from the iwi, whose people have lived alongside its waters since the first settlement of Aotearoa. This is not a metaphor. It is a statute. It is law, and it represents something important about where the Taniwha tradition stands in the contemporary world. Not as a relic, not as a curiosity preserved in the amber of anthropological record, but as a living framework of understanding that is actively shaping the legal and political and environmental landscape of a modern nation. The Taniwha did not produce the Whanganui legislation directly, but the worldview that produced the Taniwha, the understanding that rivers and harbors and deep ocean passages are not empty resources to be managed, but presences to be reckoned with, beings with their own integrity that human activity is obligated to respect. That worldview is precisely what the legislation encodes in the language of 21st century law. The Taniwha and Te Awa Tupua are expressions of the same essential insight, separated by 1,000 years of storytelling and arrived at, finally, by the same community. There is also, in the contemporary world, a growing conversation between Maori traditional knowledge and Western environmental science, a conversation in which the Taniwha, perhaps unexpectedly, has a role to play. Marine biologists working in New Zealand coastal waters have noted that the locations of historically documented Taniwha territories correlate with remarkable frequency to zones of significant biodiversity, unusual oceanographic activity, or ecological sensitivity. The deep pools of the named Taniwha rivers are, in many cases, the same pools that modern river ecologists identify as critical habitat for native fish species. The coastal sites associated with powerful sea-going Taniwha sit, often precisely, above sections of seafloor that contemporary surveys identify as particularly complex and ecologically rich. This is not coincidence. It is the same phenomenon we observed earlier, from a different angle, the encoding of real ecological knowledge in the durable form of story. But it is also something more. It suggests that the Taniwha tradition functioned across many centuries as a form of environmental protection. Places that were understood to be dangerous, powerful, requiring of respect and careful approach, were places that human activity left largely undisturbed. The fishing did not happen in the Taniwha's pool. The building did not happen on the Taniwha's bank. The result, over generations, was the preservation of precisely the most ecologically significant locations in a landscape, protected not by legislation, but by the understanding that they were someone else's home. That is a conservation strategy of remarkable elegance. And it worked across a span of time that no modern environmental regulation has yet been tested against. Today, Taniwha remain part of the living conversation of Maori communities throughout Aotearoa. They are spoken of in resource consent hearings and in Parliament and in the formal proceedings of the Waitangi Tribunal, which adjudicates historical claims between the Crown and Maori. They are also spoken of beside rivers, quietly, by people who know the particular stretch of water they are standing beside, and who have been told, since childhood, what lives there. These two registers, the legal and the intimate, are not separate. They are both expressions of the same continuity of relationship between a people and the land and water that has always been theirs to care for. The Taniwha, in the end, asks something of us that is not complicated, but is not easy either. It asks us to take seriously the possibility that the world is more inhabited than we can measure, that the rivers and the deep ocean passages and the thermally churning lakes have a character, a presence, that exceeds what our instruments can detect and our maps can record. That the relationship between human communities and the natural world is not one of management and resource, but of kinship and obligation. That power in the natural world deserves acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement is not weakness or superstition, but a form of intelligence that has kept people alive in difficult landscapes for a very long time. The water is still dark in the deep pools of the Waikato. The Hokianga Bar still churns on certain tides in ways that experienced harbor pilots describe, quietly, as having a character all their own. The volcanic lakes of the Rotorua Plateau still drop to depths that modern sonar maps with precision, but does not fully explain. And somewhere in the open ocean between the North and South Islands, in the Cook Strait, where the currents of the Tasman Sea and the Pacific converge in patterns that have defeated more than one confident navigator, something moves that the water does not account for on its own. The Taniwha has not gone anywhere. It was here before the first canoe crossed the horizon. It was here when those canoes arrived and their people looked at this new land's rivers and said, "Yes, this is the kind of place." It was here through the centuries of settlement and war and change and loss, and the extraordinary ongoing effort of a people to maintain who they are, in a world that has not always made that easy. And it is here now, in the law, and in the stories, and in the particular quality of attention that comes over a person who knows the tradition when they stand at the edge of certain water and feel, not fear exactly, but the awareness that they are not alone. That feeling is very old, and it has never, in all this time, been wrong.